All right, looks like we've arrived at the top of the hour. Thank you everyone who is joining us. We have a few announcements as everyone logs in. First, we are recording this session and it will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. If you'd like to ask questions of our speakers during the session, please use the Q&A area to the right of your screen in Whova. The chat window is where you can engage with other attendees. And we kindly ask you to keep your microphones and cameras off until a presenter asks you to engage with cameras and microphones, which we will, if that's an easier way to ask questions. Also, it looks like we're ready to start, so I'm going to hand it over to our speakers to begin. Charles, you're up first. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, everyone. Let me share my screen here. Okay, great. So it looks like everyone can see that. Thanks, Ryan, for keeping us going. So my name is Charles Scarborough. I'm a scientist at Sonoma Technology. Sonoma Technology is an air quality consulting firm based in Petaluma, California. It's in the Northern Bay Area. Today, I'll be talking about the 2020 Marin County Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And I want to recognize the other authors on this protection plan, Tammy, Brian, and Shiming. This work represents sort of a culmination of a lot of different input from many different stakeholders. So I'll get started. So here's just a general outline of the presentation. First, for those who aren't familiar, I'll be describing what a community wildfire protection plan is, and then I'll get into the specifics of the Marin County protection plan, and then I'll wrap up. So for those of you who aren't aware, a wildfire protection plan is a strategy, often in the form of a document that's developed at the local level, and that can be county, city, or even as far down as a fire district. And these plans detail and mitigate wildland fire risk to these communities. These were defined in the Healthy Forest Restoration Act passed by the federal Congress in 2003. And they serve three main functions. The first one is to identify fuel reduction treatments needed in the local community and outline methods for addressing these treatments. The second one is recommendations on measures that reduce structural ignitability, like home hardening. And the third is stakeholder collaboration and involvement, and that's a big one. And these are particularly important because they give priority status for mitigation projects for communities if they submit OCWPP, and that acts as an incentive to actually submit one and create one. And they're meant to be a dynamic strategy that changes over time and based on community inputs and needs. So a wildfire protection plan, they have to meet the following minimum requirements. So the first one, they have to be collaborative. So they have to be collaborative between just multiple stakeholders in the community, and that's it's a broad range. It can be land management agencies, NGOs, individuals, even homeowners associations, anyone who may have a stake in protecting their community. The second is to prioritize fuel reduction. So that means in the document, that means recommending treatments, prescribed fires, mechanical thinning, and other things. The third is considering treatment of structural ignitability, and that's often recommendations of measures to reduce wildland fire risk to structures, like I mentioned, home hardening. And this talk will focus on analysis that we did that relates to the third requirement, although the first two are just as important. So I'll give a brief overview of Marin County. For those not familiar, Marin County is in the northern Bay Area. It's just north of San Francisco, California, and it's south of Sonoma County. It's about 520 square miles. It has a population of about 259,000. About 18% of the country's land area falls within the wildland-urban interface, which is a large deal for Marin County. That's detailed in this map here. We have Marin County and the wildland-urban interface boundary in this hashed black boundary right here. And we can see just from this map that the building density per square mile is very high in the urban interface. So in Marin County, the urban interface is especially important because there's about 69,000 living units within the boundary. And it's a mix of natural fuels and structures with very limited access to these structures. And roads in many areas of the urban interface in Marin County are often narrow and winding, and often on hillsides or with overgrown vegetation, making access very difficult for first responders. And just to give you an idea, this is the wildland urban interface in Marin County, just a few images. And these are single family dwellings, but the urban interface includes many types of structures, including apartment complexes with many families living in them. And before I get into more detail, I just want to recognize our stakeholders in this work. There's about 35 stakeholders in all, and that's various fire departments within Marin County, CAL FIRE, National Park Service, and others. So I'll give an overview of the fire environment in Marin County. Marin County is pretty complex. There's a lot of microclimates due to topography and bordering different water bodies, like the Pacific Ocean has a huge moderating effect, and the San Francisco Bay. It's generally characterized with warm, dry summers and cool, wet winters. So most of the rainfall, the vast majority of the rainfall occurs during winter time. There's also a pretty persistent sea breeze along the coast during the summer and early fall, and that helps keep temperatures low and relative humidity values higher. There's also, importantly, there's a persistent high pressure over the Eastern Pacific Ocean. And sometimes during the summer or fall seasons, this persistent high pressure migrates eastward over the United States, and that changes wind patterns. These wind patterns can flow over the Sierra Nevada mountain range and warm and dry due to compressional heating. And these winds they can sometimes be very fast and very hot and dry, and they act to suppress the sea breeze if they're strong enough. And these winds also dry out vegetation and raise temperatures. So when winds are especially high and conditions are especially hot and dry, we usually call these Diablo winds. And Diablo winds are important here because we used Diablo winds as input in flame map fire behavior modeling. So it represents the most extreme fire behavior that we typically find in this area. And this flame map model output is fed into a parcel level wildland fire hazard assessment. So this analysis sort of quantifies immediate threat to structures on a parcel by parcel basis. And it really represents threat posed to structures by the most extreme fire behavior. And I just want to recognize that this is a novel approach by us. As far as we know, we haven't seen anyone do something like this before. And in this table, this summarizes the data inputs. The fire ecology layers, flame length, rate of spread, and burn probability are 5x5 flame map model outputs using the Diablo wind scenario, like I mentioned, and then burn history since 1970. And parcel characteristics, so the total square footage in the parcel, the year built, that's in the parcel data set, and building perimeter, the total building perimeter. So this is just a general flow describing how the parcel level analysis works. I won't go through in detail everything, but the important takeaway from this is the zonal statistics here by the flame map of the flame map results. So we start with building footprints. We create a 200-foot buffer around every single building footprint. And then we take the zonal mean of these flame map results that are in the building footprint. So once these building footprints have the zonal mean, they're joined back to once these buffers have the zonal mean, they're joined back to the building footprint. And of all those building footprints within a parcel, the maximum zonal mean is taken to represent that parcel. So the takeaway from that is the final value that the parcel takes on is the sort of the most extreme wildfire threat to the structures in that parcel. I wish I had more time to go into this, and maybe we can talk about it later. And just to give you an idea of what this looks like, these are building footprint buffers, building footprints, and flame length. So what you're seeing here is just an example parcel. We have multiple building footprints and buffers, and the zonal mean of that flame length is taken of these buffers within that parcel. And whichever building footprint has the highest flame length is what is the value that that parcel takes on. So just to and after the parcel takes on these values, they're reclassified to a common scale. So a suitability analysis essentially can be performed. Classification of flame length and rate of spread is based on physical interpretations of the data. So a parcel that has a high flame length and a high rate of spread is a parcel that would be difficult to contain, contain a fire. So that's designated as a class 3 or 4. Classification of burn probability, total square footage, and total perimeter are based on natural breaks in the data. And
Charles, about 2 minutes.
Thank you. And burn history is just a yes or no. Yes, if a parcel's been burned, it's designated class 4, no, class 1. So class 4 basically represents the most extreme or the largest threat to structures in that parcel. And I'll move on to the map. So this is the resultant map. It's in 3 categories. Category 1 is 1 to 2. Category 2 is 2 to 3, and 3 is 3 to 4. And the main takeaway I want to give here is that the wildland-urban interface sort of emerges naturally using this analysis. If you remember the map several slides ago, it had structure density in the wildland-urban interface, and everything on the eastern side of Marin County was in that urban interface. And these come out as categories 2 and 3 pretty frequently. So it's kind of reassuring that this analysis captures high density building footprints and also the fire ecology layers. So at least at a broad level, it's capturing what we intended it to. Here's a zoomed in area. This is Fairfax. It's a small community in Marin County. It's pretty residential. It has a lot of single family homes. And just a more detailed look, these are building footprints. We can see that a lot of these are in categories 2 and some even 3. So that was sort of the main point of this presentation, but I also want to recognize that this document, it's dynamic, it's a fluid document, it's not a static thing. So it's being used by Marin County fire agencies for prioritizing mitigation efforts and projects. And there are a lot of additional components that I don't have time to talk about, but importantly, these documents and the Marin County Protection Plan in particular sort of lays out strategies to mitigate wildfire risk. And these include vegetation management, like prescribed burning, importantly, and mechanical thinning that has sections on public outreach and education, and recommendations on home hardening to protect structures. And that's it. I want to thank you all for listening and take any questions.
Thanks, Charles. Appreciate that. I'm not seeing any questions in Whova currently. Do any of the panelists or any folks who are listening to the session want to turn their cameras and microphones on and ask Charles a question?
Charles, this is Yana, your next speaker.
Hi.
That was really great. So you're a consultant and you were hired through the county to do that work. What was your contractual relationship there?
Well, they hired us to write the document and perform a lot of the GIS analysis.
Right.
And that basically involves gathering a lot of information and working with those stakeholders that I mentioned.
Yeah. Well, it's a really great example of, I think, probably one of the more higher quality CWPPs that I've seen. So it's impressive to see the level of analysis that you all have been able to put into it. I find that CWPPs are an interesting tool that was designed for one intention, but it can really be tremendously beneficial from a community planning perspective to be applicable to multiple different strategies and outcomes, not just to be in line for that federal funding. So it's great to see the work you're doing there.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have other questions from the audience? Otherwise, we will move on to Yana. Okay, Charles, thank you so much. Yana, happy to have you share your screen and give your talk.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, or wherever you are on time. I'm Yana Valachovic. I'm with the University of California in the Cooperative Extension Program. And for this paper, I'm going to talk about, let me first start by introducing my colleagues. Really tremendous team here. I was able to partner with Dr. Eric Knapp and Dr. Nels Johnson from the Forest Service, and then a longstanding colleague, Dr. Steve Quarles, with the University of California Cooperative Extension, emeritus, and also retired from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. He's one of the nation's experts in home survival and the performance of individual building products. So today, I think that earlier presentation really set the stage for the kind of complex questions that we want to understand. And as difficult as it is to evaluate sort of individual policy strategies or building performance strategies in a real world environment, we do most of that through simulations and construction through the lab at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety in the Eastern Coast. But Paradise and the campfire, which I think gripped so many of us, with the idea of what a horrific firestorm could really do to a community, provided in some ways, and as difficult as it is to say this, a real living laboratory to evaluate some of those performance questions. So I'm going to talk about a retrospective study that we did looking at building survival and loss, is focusing in on the single family homes of the Camp Fire. So to talk a little bit about the fire itself, I'm going to do a little sort of general background information on the factors that tend to contribute to home loss, and then go into the study design and our key findings. So for those of you who don't know, the Camp Fire was in 2018. It was following a complicated fire season in California with a really high statistic of loss that year. The Camp Fire ignited early in one morning, and the statistics are just the kind of statistics you don't want to talk about. Almost 19,000 structures were destroyed in that almost 12-hour burn period. And because it was such a fast-moving event, it unfortunately caught 85 people up in that conflagration. A large proportion of the homes that were lost were in the town of Paradise, and so that's where we're going to focus for our analysis here. Just want to give a little sense that you're up on a plateau above the California Central Valley. The fire ignited through a power line ignition shown here in the east, moved quickly across the landscape carried by the vegetation and the wind through a canyon, and then hit the town of Paradise. There are three main arteries, and this drains to the west to the town of Chico. Magalia is over here, and you can see how many spot fires and ignitions were, ahead of the main fire front. So, this was not an atypical condition that we have in California. It was a red flag warning day, and the forecasted wind gusts were 25 to 30 miles an hour, but we saw up to 50 miles per hour, as you can see in this direction here, following that kind of Diablo Canyon, the Diablo wind discussion that we just got from Ryan, so you can kind of anticipate the sort of dynamics we were having. And so, that was forecasted, you just hope you didn't have an ignition, and unfortunately we did. So for background, when we start to look at the questions about home survival and loss, I just want to give a couple primer slides here, and that is that buildings have to be designed to resist three types of exposures. And the majority of the time we talk about direct flame contact, meaning that fire is coming from somewhere away from the home and burning towards the house itself and directly igniting some component on the house because the flames have connected. So our defensible space strategies in California talk about interruption of that. We also know that embers, and we're gaining a lot more understanding, I think, as a society about the role that embers can have, where you get longer distance transport, maybe even up to a mile or more, with fire brands, and those are lofted in the air currents, and they're and if they find receptive materials like in the gutter shown here or in the vegetation surrounding this building, they can create spot fires. They can also penetrate buildings through cat doors, open windows, and as well vents, which can allow two-way air exchange, which is important for building survival from a moisture management perspective, but can become vulnerable locations. The third type of exposure is something called radiant heat, and that's where you have ignition of a nearby building. You don't have direct contact with flames, but you have heat transfer through the air sufficient enough to create either combustion or perhaps a failure of some component of the building. This is being illustrated here by a broken window, which then creates a void, and you can either have flames enter or embers enter or something to that effect. So when we think about fire performance, we need to make sure that we think about all three types of these fire exposures and how one might design and mitigate and protect a building in its exterior envelope against these different types of forces. So just a couple more illustrations. Here's what embers can look like. This is taken in the town of Paradise. You can see how pervasive they are and how insidious they are and how they are capable of finding all the little small locations in our buildings. Where leaves collect is often where embers will accumulate. And we're, I think, as a society, getting a much better handle on the idea that embers are a major contributor, especially to home loss. This is an image from the Angora fire in Lake Tahoe, where, it almost looked like a spaceship came down and gamma rays, blasted that house away, because in our old way of thinking about fire, it wasn't really a fire that was carried by the vegetation itself, right? The vegetation is doing just fine, but something allowed this building to ignite, and that was likely embers that either landed on or in this building and created an ignition point. We're getting a better understanding of kind of home hardening principles in some of the particularly vulnerable locations. And these are just meant to give us a little illustration of what those might be. So roof to wall intersections where the wall doesn't perform as well as the roofing, gutters, and the fire capable of igniting and getting underneath the roofing material itself, a fence to house contact, and then the bottom two illustrations are examples of embers penetrating either under eave vents or gable end vents, and if they find something that's combustible and receptive on the inside, you can create ignition on the inside of the building. So given all of that, we had three fundamental questions about the data that's available for Paradise. As I said, this was a post-fire study here, a retrospective study. So did the proximity of nearby structures factor into probability of survival? So getting at that radiant heat question. And then second, did the fuel associated with nearby vegetation factor into the probability of survival? So looking more at the canopy and other elements of the vegetation. And then we were also very curious about some new policies that have led to changes in California's building code, which were initiated in California in 2008, where the exterior of the building has a new level of standards meant to be resistive to wildfire. So was there an improved odds of survival for those structures that were built after 2008? So as I said earlier, Paradise is kind of an amazing living laboratory to be able to test these questions. No one in their right mind would allow us to build buildings and then put wildfire in a real setting and test some of those assumptions. But if you can look back at Paradise, it gives us some interesting opportunity to do that. So we took the assessor database from Butte County from 2018. We sorted that into about 8,000 single family homes, and we coded those in 3 time periods. And what we were really interested in was this population of homes that were built from 2008 and sooner. So those are part of the new construction codes. And then what did it look like the previous decade? So we could compare either side of the construction code and then the body of older homes. We were able to access something called damage inspection data, which CAL FIRE, our fire agency, will do post-burn to evaluate the homes that survived but may have been damaged and give us some indication as to what happened in those locations. So those homes, all the homes within this 8,000 population level were sorted into destroyed, damaged, where there might have been some kind of fire exposure that led to windows or bubbled paint or melted gutters, or no impact. So when you look at this image here, this is the town of Paradise. You can see they're color-coded. Red are those newer homes. And much to our surprise, they're not just like one subdivision off in its corner. They're pretty well distributed across the footprint of Paradise, as are the homes that are on the previous decade of that in green, and then compared to the older homes in white. So the pattern of development was good and well distributed for this kind of analysis. We then took that population of 8,000 homes and subsampled 400 of them, stratified to give kind of an equal balance of homes in this new construction period, 2008 to 2018, because there were 142 homes built during that time period. So we took 100 of those randomly, and then we took 100 of the homes from the previous decade, and then we took 200 homes of all other decades. And you can see how they're stratified by different time periods here in this graph on the right, which I'll describe more in detail later. But here, think about age, older homes on the left, newer homes on the right, and percent survival. So the trends are getting better towards those newer homes, but let's get into this analysis a little more before I describe what we see here. So what we did is we then used Google Earth to give us some greater indication of proximity to other buildings and the percent of overstory cover. So subject home in right here, and we looked at the canopy cover visually estimated in a 30-meter circle as well as in a 100-meter radius circle. Then for those homes that were in our population. We then measured the distance to the nearest destroyed. Here's an example of a destroyed building. And those nearest destroyed structures could be anything: homes, businesses, garages, outbuildings. We didn't evaluate cars and boats and those kinds of things, but those certainly could be contributing factors. One caveat, this is a post-fire study, so we didn't start with much pre-burn data, so we don't know what the understory cover was like. We really don't know about how well people implemented defensible space. So there are limitations there. We use lot size. Do you know were the lots bigger, smaller, what happened there? And then we also looked at land use. So we hear a lot about WUI, the wildland urban intermix, and those were defined or separated into two types: interface and intermix. Interface being greater in density, intermix being more dispersed with the wildland vegetation. And then we also looked at elements like slope and aspect and those kinds of pieces. So a lot of data, and I'm just going to cut to the punchline. We actually have really clear, strong signals in the data that explain a tremendous amount of the survival and loss data. So I'm just going to highlight a few of those. I'll get to the punchline in a bit. But I want to also talk about some variables that were not predictive. So canopy cover closer to the building was not statistically significant, nor were those land use codes. And that's really important because we spent a lot of time in California talking about land use and where we should build and not build and thinking about land use. And so land use itself was not a significant driver. There were other factors that were more important in what we experienced here in Paradise. So after many components of the statistical analysis, we finally just settled in on using a decision tree analysis where you put all the data in and you let the computer algorithms basically sort that to figure out what variables are the biggest drivers. And what we see is that the first split of that decision tree is the distance to the nearest destroyed having the greatest impact on survival probability. So your neighbor's condition is as important as anything else in the subject building's survival. So question, did the proximity to nearby structures factor into the probability of survival? Yes, absolutely it did. So the threshold of less than 18 meters was the best distinguished between surviving and destroyed homes. So 76% of our homes were less than 18 meters of a destroyed structure. That's a huge population of the data. 26% were of greater separation. So then the second question, did the fuel associated with nearby vegetation factor into the probability of survival? And the answer was yes. So if the homes were 18 meters and greater from a destroyed structure and the canopy cover was less than 53%, the probability of survival was about 48%. So the interesting thing, when you boil that all down, what was the best predictor of survival? 73% of the homes survived when they were greater than 18 meters away from a destroyed structure. Had they have less canopy, a moderate amount of canopy in the 30 to 100 meter circle, and are built after 1973, so they're newer and they're on moderate slopes. But only 7.5% of the houses met that category. I mean, we had a lot of homes that lost, but that really says some pretty strong and significant information. So in Paradise, when you start to dig into it, and we also looked at those population of homes that were damaged, and we did a lot of analysis on those just to try and understand it, what we really see is that the radiant heat was really the substantial factor for damaged homes. And this aerial image here on the left shows these ashen gray footprints of homes that were lost. And you can see the vegetation, the forested vegetation that was around it. And overall, what you see is that there's a lot of green. This wasn't a crown fire but just a few locations, but this proximity, this adjacency factor to nearest destroyed was a very significant element. And of those homes that did survive, where in Paradise, there was almost no firefighter response because the focus was on getting people out of harm's way. That's where the effort was. So those buildings basically had to survive on their own. 63% of the damaged homes were damaged from radiant heat alone. So this points to some interesting things. And that really shows a neighborhood or a community effect and how we're all in this together. Here's a couple more aerial images. You can see how, whole blocks can have a relationship effect and be lost. And if you keep the integrity of one section together, look how those buildings are able to survive. So this idea that I just want to say that we're all in this together, and we have to figure out how to work together to figure out how to be adapted to live in California.
Yana, about 2 minutes.
Okay, so I'm almost done here. So driving into the final question, was the full adoption of Chapter 7A associated with an improved odds of survival? You can see that the trends between 2007 and the two populations on either side of the construction code, they are improving, but they were not statistically different from each other. So there are some other things that are at play. There's some other opportunities to refine and improve Chapter 7A. And so there wasn't just a singular effect of Chapter 7A. So in conclusion, there is a component associated with vegetation management, and I want to grab where that is. And we think it's really about indirect effects where you can see leaves and other material that accumulate, and that creates some risk and concern. We also see that the standard practices of defensible space are evolving, and we're now moving in California to this idea of zone 0, which is a non-combustible zone around the footprint of the building. We think this will better protect buildings overall. But there's some limit in our analysis because pre-fire vegetation data was limited. But from a neighborhood effect, we can clearly see that relationship between buildings and how from an epidemiological perspective, in essence, when there's more saturation of loss, in this case, there's more likelihood of loss overall. We do think that construction standards and materials are making a difference, and newer homes are performing better in general. That's in part because roofing has a long service life. We're fairly standard implementing double pane windows in all of our buildings, but maintenance is key. And so, so we can get into some of these questions about density and how density matters and how we think about these issues. But I'll just suggest that there was a lot to be learned from Paradise, and that 18-meter threshold, which is about 53 feet, is similar to other findings in fires in the United States, such as the Witch Fire and the Waldo Canyon Fire in California and the Black Cub Fire in Tennessee. So with that, I will, I have one last thing. I just want to end with this idea that there's reason for hope. I think what's really impressive here is that there's strong statistical outcomes that are pointing us towards achievable actions. And, in essence, we're in an evolution, right? And we have responded to other natural disasters in different ways than we have with fire. We don't fight earthquakes, tornadoes, or hurricanes. We adapt and build smarter. And so I think there's opportunity to incentivize existing construction to both improve defensible space and do greater home hardening. And there's opportunity for us to, better engage in the construction codes practices in California. The good news is that codes all evolve with time, and this data is getting out there, and people are interested in what we're finding here and giving opportunity for an enhanced level conversation. So I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Yana. Do any of the panelists or attendees have any questions? Please turn your microphones. Looks like Charles has a question. Go ahead, Charles.
Hey Yana, thanks for that talk. That's really fascinating. And I couldn't help but be kind of struck how pertinent it was to my talk, even in terms of home hardening and defensible space. And I guess I'd like to know, is there a fire since the Camp Fire in 2018 that could, I guess, act as a similar test bed for a similar study?
Well, it's a great question. I'm not a walking encyclopedia of all fires in California, because it would need to be a California fire to be able to evaluate, some more of these construction code pieces. The really unique thing about the Camp Fire is that it was a fairly uniform burn period of 12 hours. Basically, the wind was on and then the wind was off. I see Don Henkins is in the room. I'm sure he can corroborate some of that. I think since 2018, the fires that I have kept my ear to have different characteristics. They have different flavors. And so I think that becomes a little bit more challenging because you have this other intersection of firefighter response that makes it more difficult to know which homes got some level of service, which homes did not. And so there is that whole other dynamic that adds into an analysis like this, because it's not a controlled study, right? It's really trying to do something retrospective where you want to hold as many variables constant as you can. But maybe others in this conversation have some knowledge about other conditions and other locations where you get that more uniform like burn period, as well as a significant population that straddle either side of that construction code. The construction codes really are under modification. They get adapted and improved every 3 years, and we're in a review process there. And so I think there'll be more thought given to the radiant heat pieces, because how we think about radiant heat is an evolving thought, and how different building components and different products meet and tie into the approval process, right? It's a standalone component, assembly related. There's some variety and thought about how you meet the standard.
Thank you.
I see Kara has a question. Kara, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering, you talked about forest-borne embers and you talked about radiant energy hitting structures. I'm wondering, did you see any evidence in this work of structure-borne embers and then the impact that may have on other structures?
Right, and that's a terrific question, because there's embers come in many forms and flavors, and we were not on the ground during this fire, but have had a number of interviews and conversations with folks that were. And, my own experience and knowledge in the space is that in this case, we had a wildland ignition through a power line. So clearly the embers that ignited, that were involved in that were vegetation driven. But once you create ignition in buildings and you've got wind behind it, there's a whole nother effect of the construction related embers that are associated with it. I have a sort of a running hypothesis also that trailer parks are particularly vulnerable, and I have this suspicion, I don't have an easy way to analyze it, that trailer parks do have an impact. I think they sort of blow apart. There's a lot of trailer parks in Paradise, but that's just a hunch on mine. I don't mean to drive us down into that rabbit hole, but once you have ignition of an adjacent building, then you've got the radiant heat component with that, and then you have the embers, if you've got wind behind the fire, that are contributing from that. So you're in the the wash of all of that effort, or all of that material. So there's a lot for that building to resist.
Thank you.
Yana, there's one question in Huva that I'm going to have you answer real quickly, then we're going to kick it over to Jacob. So very interesting. This is from Karen Riley. Very interesting study. Is it safe to say that an ember must have ignited those blocks of houses, but then radiant heat carries the fire to other houses on the block? It doesn't look like radiant heat would be sufficient to carry the fire across streets, as we see many green trees still in yards.
Right. I think it's a whole combination effect. The fire environment is pretty dynamic, and so embers likely create that initial ignition, but embers are continued to be generated through time with the wind there. So I don't think we can isolate it into one. I think it's a both and. One factor, it's many factors.
Thanks, Yana, and thanks for presenting today. I'm going to kick it over to Jacob. You're up.
Hey, thank you. And thanks, Yana. I found it quite interesting, your presentation also, because it reveals the extent to which wildfire can be treated as a design problem, and the consequences that design decisions, whether on the scale of the building or of the neighborhood or of the town, can have influences on the damages and behavior of that fire. And that's a bit of a good tie over to my presentation. Hi, everybody. My name is Jacob Heydorn Gorski, and I'm a final year master's student in landscape architecture at the Amsterdam Academy of Architecture. And next to my studies, I work for the city of Amsterdam as a landscape architect. And my own presentation is based on ongoing research and design project as part of my graduation, advised in part by Sarah McCaffrey of the Forest Service's Rocky Mountain Research Station. So I'd like to thank her. My project addresses what I see as an urgent need for collaboration between the fire and design disciplines, and also its potential for new understandings, narratives, and approaches to wildfire. There. Yeah, as we know, we live in a fiery world, and the American landscape is no exception to this. Historically, fire has been a natural actor that has benefited certain ecosystems. It's shaped us humans as much as we have used it to shape our landscapes. This fire, however, has changed. Accumulated effects from land management decisions, new land uses, and a changing climate have coalesced into unsustainable ecosystem conditions, and with them, a fire that's burning hotter and longer than before. This fire not only has the ability to damage and disrupt such ecosystems, but the scale and frequency at which it's burned has also increasingly impacted broader issues facing our landscapes. Colorado's Front Range Mountains, which is the focus of my project, is no exception to these trends. Here, wildfire in this fire-adapted ecosystem increasingly coexists alongside other landscape pressures, such as urbanization, habitat fragmentation, and recreation. Here you see sort of a buildup of different layers, as you could call them, of the Colorado landscape. And the Front Range's rich topography as part of the Southern Rocky Mountains forms the basis for a gradient of soils, ecosystems, forest types, and also a variety of different wildfires. Together, these factors produce a range of varied historical fire regimes unique to each ecosystem. These fires have started to burn hotter, longer, and more frequently. And the 2020 wildfire season in Colorado destroyed homes and lives. It shut down campgrounds and hiking trails, led to flooding and water quality issues, and it burned thousands of hectares of forest habitat. And fires like the Cameron Peak Fire, which you see here, left huge burn scars on the landscape and led to protracted problems that continue to this day. At the same time, Colorado is one of the fastest growing states, with most future growth concentrated along the fire-prone Front Range. This growing population will place additional demands on the area's natural resources and outdoor spaces in the years to come, as more and more residents rely on the services the Front Range provides, from wilderness experiences to clean water for its breweries. As a result, not only will wildfire likely increasingly impact the landscape in the years to come, but its effects will also be felt by more and more people. As a result, fire will increasingly impact broader issues like recreation and landscape access in fire-prone regions. Nevertheless, our present framework for understanding wildfire remains in many ways largely based on how we fight it. The default way we talk about wildfire is often in terms of defensible space, operational logistics, and risk reduction. These terms and ideas remain, of course, important, but our focus on them comes at the risk, I think, of failing to consider fire's full complexity of its benefits and effects. Here in the Netherlands, where I work and study, there's a long history of battling another natural foe, water. Over centuries, the Dutch have constructed an elaborate system of dikes, levees, and channels to pump out water and expand arable land. For a long time, water was understood by the Dutch as something they needed to defend themselves from. But this quest for control over water led to the development of over-engineered, inflexible systems that often failed when strained. Disastrous floods in the 20th century, like the one you see here, opened the discussion in the Netherlands to new ways of dealing with water. And this has led to a shift in the Netherlands towards recognizing and appreciating the role of designing around the natural dynamics of water. More room is being given back to the river, allowing it to flood and follow its natural course. Landscape architecture has been central to orchestrating this shift. Projects like the one above on the right by the Dutch firm H&S have redesigned old river dikes into more resilient situations, temporarily accommodate extra flooding, and provide a richer habitat while still ensuring a high degree of safety. This design is also actually given back to the people living nearby, offering them new exciting ways to experience water and improving quality of life in the city. perhaps we can learn from the Dutch in our own efforts. Similarly, our 20th century fire policy has treated fire for a long time as something that had to be controlled and suppressed at all costs. And this effort, although well-intentioned, has led to unsustainable conditions and often false expectations about fire. Fire is breaching our dikes, so to speak. So like the Dutch, we're in a moment of reckoning where we need to renegotiate our relationship with this natural force. And what happens if we accept fire as part of the landscape, like river? Can we find win-win scenarios where fire not only enriches the landscape, but also our experience of it? To do so, I think we need to reconnect and reposition wildfire management within this broader range of social and ecological issues affecting the landscape. I think landscape architecture is particularly well positioned to help us in this process. As a discipline, it increasingly occupies itself with a spatial relationship between natural and anthropogenic systems. Not only the Dutch are reimagining and innovating this relationship. In America, like you see here, offices like Scape are reimagining new coastlines in the Northeast that provide flood resiliency through softer land-water transitions that also provide valuable oyster habitat. Despite this, though, the field has paid relatively little attention as a whole to the topic of wildfire. And within the fire science disciplines, there's likewise unrealized potential to experiment and design new approaches to mitigating and recovering from wildfire. To connect the two fields, I think, is not a question of reinventing the wheel, but of reconnecting its spokes. Because wildfire is a phenomenon that's nestled within landscape, land use, and culture, as we've seen. What happens when we begin to reintegrate it? Within this context, my project will investigate what such a fire-resilient landscape could look like. What potentials does it offer for new forms of education, recreation, wildlife viewing, and habitat? Can it produce new aesthetics, understandings, connections, or narratives about fire? My project will explore these questions by focusing on a town in Colorado's Front Range. Red Feather Lakes, which you see here, is a small unincorporated town in Larimer County, northwest of Fort Collins. Before it was settled, it was inhabited by Native Americans who benefited from anthropogenic and naturally occurring fire in the area. It was settled in the mid-19th century by ranchers and loggers who, in the context of water rights battles, dug a series of man-made lakes to ensure their own water supply. And in the 20th century, the town rebranded itself with its current name and invented a history that framed it as an idyllic escape into a rustic mountain pass. The town serves as an ideal case study because of many of the Front Range's issues which coalesce here. The town is a small enclave of permanent residents and seasonal inhabitants nestled on private land, but abutting Roosevelt National Park. It's also a recreational hotspot that's a short drive from major cities like Fort Collins. And it's located at the border of two forest types that each have their own historical fire regimes. Furthermore, the Cameron Peak Fire in 2020 burned a large area just to the south and southeast of the town. As the region urbanizes, towns like Red Feather Lakes will experience these effects most acutely. Without systemic intervention, they also find themselves at higher risk, both in terms of homes and infrastructure, but also risk to the landscape at the foundation of its appeal and economy. So what's being done? The last Community Wildfire Protection Plan proposed extending some fuel breaks, conducting prescribed burning, maintaining evacuation routes, and creating defensible space in residential areas. And these are, of course, important. But given the town's historical capacity to adapt itself and reinvent itself to meet changing conditions, can we imagine doing more than just this? And in the next phase of my project, which is ongoing, I will be focusing on how I can not only design a more resilient landscape for Red Feather Lakes, but also in doing so, provide additional value for people living and recreating in the area. Can we use fire to actually solve more than one of the area's problems at once?
Take about 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm getting to the end. So as I move into the design phase, my project is grounded on several principles. The first one is that fire is a process, not an event. And fire, as we know, its behavior and its effects occupy a longer temporal threshold than just the fire itself. Decisions and climatic conditions leading up to a fire can influence how it burns. And likewise, after a fire, the way a landscape recovers and what it evolves into are deeply influenced by pre-existing conditions. As a designer, what I do before a fire is at least as important as what I do after it. And these can have various effects on the landscape as well. For example, preventative thinning and prescribed burning can introduce new habitat and forest clearings that provide opportunities for wildlife viewing or allow for wider or multi-use trails. A forest after a fire, on the other hand, can provide a powerful emotional setting for experience and learning about landscape. The second theme is grounding really fire in its social context and integrating the results of this design with the local community as much as it's integrated with the landscape. Defining a community's landscape or a community's values for its landscape can allow us to guide the process in a way that accentuates those qualities. Moreover, how can a fire keep a community engaged? Can we use renewal and regrowth to create moments where the community can come together for the landscape and celebrate the effects and processes of the fiery landscapes that they live in? And the last point has to do with working towards a vernacular aesthetic that is an aesthetic that's specific to a particular fire-prone landscape. In Colorado, I've drawn inspiration from the palette of forms, objects, and textures that occur with the forest and its fire. These you see include blue stain patterns in the wood of beetle kill pine, in burnt soil and heat-cracked granite, in slash piles in burnt wood as an architectural material, and even in the voids left in the ground from trees after they've burned. By being a detective in the forensic landscape, we can find sort of the ways in which fire can reveal the natural beauty of this landscape and make us look at a familiar forest anew and also spark a flame in our imagination. So my project is ongoing, so my process is incomplete, and my story for now ends here. But if I want to leave you with anything, I hope it's an interest in how these two disciplines can work together to imagine sort of new futures and possibilities that help us find our way through the predicament that is wildfire. And I'll be finishing my project in the late spring of 2022, and I hope to share the results with you at the next Congress. And if you have any questions, thoughts, or feedback after this session that you don't ask here, please feel free to contact me via my email. And that's my presentation.
Jacob, thank you. Appreciate that. Any panelists or attendees have any questions? If they do, please turn your microphone and camera on and feel free to ask Jacob. Looks like Charles has a question.
Hey, Jacob. Yeah, that was really interesting. And being from a science background, it's great to hear like more perspectives in this Congress. So yeah, I really appreciate your talk. And the town that you use sort of as a case, I think it's interesting because it's sort of, single family dwellings, right? I guess I would just like to get your perspective on how you get the community engaged in the sort of projects that you're talking about, because it's often, I don't know, from my experience out in the West, it's a lot of the general public is adverse to prescribed burnings, just because of the culture associated with it in the past. So.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And that's part of why I sort of really want to focus on community engagement also during the design process, because I think a successful design is not sort of a top-down decision, but actually something that's built up with residents. And I had the pleasure of spending a few days in Red Feather Lakes talking with some of the residents as part of this research and sort of hearing their thoughts about wildfire. And I was sort of happy to hear that most of them are quite knowledgeable and quite aware of the issue of fire, in part because of recent fires close by, but I think also of growing up in a landscape where fire is unavoidable. On many of their commutes, they're driving along and past burn scars. So there's sort of a realistic outlook that living with fire is part of a reality. And if you want to sort of enjoy that lifestyle, you can't do it without also sharing space with fire. And so I think there's starting ground to start that conversation. And then the question is ultimately what the final design will look like. That'll be coming back later. But I did sense in openness to sort of imagining new relationships with fires or new possibilities for it.
Thank you. That's really nice.
Do we have any other questions for Jacob? All right, then we are going to roll on. Rebecca, you are up next.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Lemons. I'm with Oregon State University, and I'd like to really quick thank my co-collaborators, Susan Pritchard and Becky Kurtz. Susan Pritchard is from University of Washington, Becky Kurtz from the U.S. Forest Service. Today I'm going to give you a talk about evaluating methodology for measuring fireline effectiveness. Oops. Oh, hold on. There it goes. So fire lines have become an integral part of fighting fire, especially helping control wildfires and for fire management. But like with everything, there's costs associated with them. This is including money and time and also human resources. But there's also the environmental cost, which fire lines have been associated with erosion and spread of invasive species. One thing to realize is we currently lack a really good fundamental way for evaluating fireline effectiveness. However, if we do come up with one, we can then use it to help start comparing different suppression investments as well as the potential ecological impacts of those fire lines. And lastly, we can then use that information to help inform rehabilitation strategies for after the fire. So in 2020, Gannon ETL came out with a methodology for evaluating fireline effectiveness. Oops, went too far. There we go. For evaluating fireline effectiveness. This methodology was based upon 4 different metrics that he looked at and examined, which examined suppression effort, the overall fireline effectiveness, the engaged to total fireline ratio, and the held to engaged fireline ratio. This methodology also relied upon 2 main inputs, which were the fire perimeters themselves and the fire lines. Gannon's methodology incorporated a buffer around those fire perimeters, which is an important part of this methodology that I'm going to discuss about in a minute. So overall, Gannon's methodology, we wanted to really examine how robust this methodology was for evaluating fireline effectiveness. So to really get at the strengths and weaknesses of this methodology, we examined first the 2 initial inputs, which were fire perimeters and then the fire lines. And we wanted to look at with fire lines how accuracy would have an effect on those inputs. We also examined that buffer size that I just mentioned earlier, which is 50 meters, is what Gannon et al. Suggested. And then we looked at how burn severity would affect your results for this fireline effectiveness methodology. So the study area we used, we looked at 13 different fires in northern Washington from 2014 to 2017. Most of these fires ranged from 1,900 to roughly 104,000 hectares. So most of these were moderate to large size fires. So to test fireline accuracy, we looked at correcting 3 types of different fire lines that were employed during these fires, including bulldozer lines, hand lines, and road as completed lines. Now, for those who aren't familiar with it, bulldozer lines are those that are carved out using bulldozers, usually along old trails or pathways or old roads to remove fuels. Hand lines are usually involve crews sent in with hand tools to remove the fuels. And then roads as completed are usually established roadways, which really require minimal or no additional work to help keep the fuels away from that line. And for this entire project, we really closely followed Gannon's methodology that he established because we really wanted to look at that. Correcting fire lines was done manually in ArcGIS, and we looked at spatial locations inaccuracies, misclassifications, and duplications. So for testing the fire perimeters, we looked at 3 different types of fire perimeters that were available to us. The FL stands for the Fireline perimeters that came with the Fireline data themselves. The MTBS, which is monitoring trans and burn severity database fire perimeters, and then a fire perimeter from the soil burn severity from the Bayer. We applied, instead of the 50-meter buffer, we looked at varying different ranges of buffers from 15 meters to 480 meters across all those 3 different types. For testing burn severity, we use the burn severity established by the Bayer, and we use their high, moderate, low, and very low classification scheme. We use the corrected fire lines for this and also applied a 60-meter buffer. We had to remove 3 fires because they didn't have SPS data. For those who aren't familiar, the SPS data has an additional fieldwork component, which is why some fires lack that data for it. It has to be specially requested. So the results for our Fireline accuracy, when we went to measure how does Fireline accuracy affect your Fireline results, we found that actually your spatial location and accuracies really did not have little to no effect for what's going to determine your suppression effort or your fire effectiveness, Fireline effectiveness. And this is because Gannon's buffer that he puts in and his methodology really helps increase that robustness of the overall methodology. So this will help save a lot of hours of work future on down. However, one thing we did find is misclassifications could dramatically increase your Fireline length and therefore increase and change your results. For example, the Renner fire had an increase of Fireline length of 50%. For this graph on the right, what you see is you want your fires to be in this low suppression with a high amount of effectiveness. So a low amount of effort going in to help suppress that fire and is highly effective. So for Renner, it went from this low suppression, high effectiveness, which is what you want to see in a fire, to when we corrected it, it actually went into this high suppression, low effectiveness, which is what you don't want to see when you're trying to establish fire lines. It required too much effort and it wasn't very effective for those fires. And we saw this in a couple other fires which had these misclassification errors. For results for fire perimeters, for looking at the 3 different fire perimeters, we found that it was your Fireline effectiveness is going to be highly dependent on your fire perimeter. So SPS tended to be more reliable for our fire perimeters is what we found. This is because, like I mentioned earlier, that SPS has an additional field verification, unlike MTBS. MTBS had a tendency to dissolve unburnt patches. So as you can see in this graphic on the right, the MTBS, the hole is missing. They counted it as burned when in fact, during this Carlton fire, there was a whole big section of the fire where it did not burn. So those fire lines actually should have been held a lot more and been a lot more effective than what MTBS said it would. For buffer size, when we looked at increasing buffers, as you can see on the right, as you increase your buffer size, it actually artificially increases your effectiveness of your fire lines, your engaged to total fire line ratio, held to engaged ratio, and the held to total fire line length ratio. As I said, it basically shows that you're artificially telling it all these fire lines actually engaged the fire and actually held when they didn't. So this indicates that you really need to choose your buffer size carefully, and that should probably be based on your fire perimeters that you're using. When we looked at burn severity, we found that low burn severity actually had a low suppression effort and a tendency to have a high effectiveness. This is what you want to see. But on the other side, we had a high severity had a greater suppression effort, a much lower level of effectiveness, which is intuitive and that's what you would expect. But it should be noted that a lot of these high severity areas that burned were these dense mixed conifer forests that hadn't burned in a while. And we were finding this trend in that area of these dense mixed conifer forests burning at these high severities. And what that really indicates is that establishing fire lines in areas of high severity of fires may not be a practical use of your resources when you're trying to figure out where you want to put fire lines. That said, being on the ground is a lot different than after the fact with this methodology. So in conclusion, Gannon methodology is actually rather robust, especially when it comes to spatial inaccuracies. However, with misclassifications can significantly change your results. So really, this needs to have an additional component where you're looking and making sure that all the fire lines have been classed correctly. Also, we found that your fire perimeters and your fire buffer sizes should be chosen carefully. In reality, that should be based more on what kind of fire perimeters you're using. The 50 meter is relatively well for your MTBS and your SBS because both of those are based off the Landsat, which uses 30 meter pixels for correct construction. In conclusion, it really needs to be said that this is a retrospective analysis. What people see on the ground at the time of the fire can be a lot different for after the fact. So the idea behind this methodology is really to help plan future placements of fire lines and maybe help reduce some of those costs that occur when these, especially these major fire events occur. Fire severity really should be considered when placing placing fire lines, and also that would help reduce costs and site impacts. And lastly, one of the things we found when we were going through this is that there really needs to be an improved quality of record keeping for these fire line attributes and construction dates. It also will help aid for research and future mop-up operations. And this can easily be done, especially now with technology, with carrying new advanced GPS units for crews out in the field, either on dozer units or hand crews, to help map fire lines faster, easier, and more accurately. All right, thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
Thanks, Rebecca. We have time for some questions. Does anyone have any questions for Rebecca? You can unmute and turn your video on if you do. Okay, Rebecca, I'm not seeing any questions. I'm going to close out the session. Thank you so much for participating. Firstly, I want to thank all of our speakers for sharing their expertise. The session will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the conference ends. Be sure to join us at our closing plenary session starting at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. This session will feature our AFIA Special Award announcements, keynote speaker Paulo Fernandez, Associate Professor at University of Três Montes, and Lania Quinn Davidson, Area Fire Advisor for the University of California Cooperative Extension. To choose the one you'd like to join, use the Agenda tab to the left of the screen and click Sessions, and then click the main session title to join. Thanks again to our speakers and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks all. Take care. Bye.